Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the evolution of international environmental law. And look, if you're a law student, this is absolutely a need-to-know topic. We're going to trace how we went from a world where every nation was basically a king in its own castle to a world where we're starting to accept that we have a shared responsibility for the entire planet. It's quite a journey, so let's get into it. So this one question really gets to the heart of the whole story, doesn't it? The journey from making laws to protect, quote, useful birds, all the way to negotiating these massive, complex global climate treaties, well, it shows a complete radical shift in how we think about the planet, about our economies, and about what we really owe to the generations that come after us. Here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll kick things off before the landmark Stockholm Conference. Then we'll walk through the major summits in Rio and Johannesburg. After that, we'll break down the key legal principles you absolutely have to know. And finally, we'll see where this journey has taken us so far. You know, before the 1970s, international environmental law as a concept, it just didn't really exist. Sure, there were laws that happened to protect parts of the environment, but that was almost always an accident, a side effect. The real goal was always economic, or it was just about respecting your neighbor's property line. These early agreements were all about what nature could do for us. I mean, take that 1902 convention, for example. It literally created a list of useful birds, the ones that eat insects off farmers' crops, and a list of harmful ones. The environment itself didn't have any value. It only mattered if it was useful to people. It was all piecemeal and completely driven by human needs. But even back then, a few legal fights laid some incredibly important groundwork. First up, the Bering Sea fur seals case. It basically established that a country's power ends at its own borders. But then, the Trail Smelter case added this huge critical caveat. Okay, your sovereignty is one thing, but it doesn't give you the right to harm your neighbors with your pollution. That gave us the famous no-harm principle. And finally, the Lake Lanús arbitration added a rule of, let's call it neighborly conduct. You have a duty to let your neighbors know about projects that could affect them. These three cases, they're really the bedrock of this whole field. And then 1972 happened, and everything changed. People were waking up. You had books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that incredible Earthrise photo from space, and the world came together in Stockholm. This wasn't about protecting one type of seal or settling one border dispute anymore. This was about the entire human environment. And this right here, Principle 21 from the Stockholm Declaration, just perfectly captures the central tension in all of environmental law. It's a two-sided coin. On one side, you have a country's sovereign right to use its own stuff, but on the other, you have the responsibility to make sure you're not causing harm beyond your borders. It essentially took that precedent from the Trail Smelter case and made it a global norm. Now, Stockholm wasn't just a big talk fest. It actually delivered three major concrete outcomes. First, the declaration, setting out those big ideas like Principle 21. Second, a 109-point action plan for how to actually do things. And third, and this is huge, it created a brand new institution, the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, to coordinate everything. Stockholm basically built the whole political, legal, and institutional architecture for modern environmental law from the ground up. Okay, let's fast forward 20 years to 1992, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The world was a different place. The Cold War was over, and a new divide was becoming really clear. It wasn't East versus West anymore. It was the developed North versus the developing South. And that meant the conversation had to change too. And this table just illustrates that evolution perfectly. The focus shifted from just the environment to this much bigger, more complicated idea of sustainable development. And where Stockholm was mostly governments talking to governments, Rio was a huge festival of ideas, flooded with NGOs and the private sector. But most importantly, and for any law student, this is the key difference, while Stockholm gave us soft law in a declaration, Rio gave us hard law, legally binding treaties like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So what is this sustainable development that was so central to Rio? This is the classic definition. It was this powerful idea meant to bridge that north-south gap. It says, yes, developing nations have a right to grow their economies, but that growth can't come at the cost of the environment or the well-being of future generations. It's a balancing act that, frankly, we're still trying to get right today. Right, so by 2002, another 10 years after Rio, the world had a whole library full of principles and treaties. The problem? There was this massive gap between what was written down on paper and what was actually happening on the ground. The big summit in Johannesburg was all about trying to close that implementation gap. Johannesburg also helped us get a much clearer picture of what sustainable development actually means. It took Rio's two main pillars, environment and economy, and formally added a third, totally equal pillar, social development. The insight here is brilliant, really. True sustainability is like a three-legged stool. You need economic growth, you need social equity, and you need environmental protection. If one leg is missing, the whole thing falls over. So the biggest takeaway from Johannesburg is this major pivot from just setting norms to actually taking action. The summit flat out said that poverty is the single biggest roadblock to sustainability, and it called for real partnerships, including with the private sector, to tackle it. The question was no longer, what should we do? It became, why isn't this stuff working, and how the heck do we fix it? Okay, now let's quickly consolidate some of the most important legal principles that were really firmed up by the time we got to the Rio Summit. For anyone prepping for an exam, these are absolutely non-negotiable. You have to know them. First up, the precautionary principle. The easiest way to think about this one is better safe than sorry. It means you don't have to wait for 100% ironclad scientific proof that something's causing harm before you take action to stop it, especially if the potential damage is really serious or permanent. It basically flips the burden of proof. Second, the polluter pays principle. This one's both an economic and a legal idea. It's pretty simple. The person or company responsible for creating the pollution should be the one who pays the cost of managing it and cleaning it up. It's all about making sure those environmental costs are internalized on a company's balance sheet instead of being externalized for the rest of society to pay for. And third, a principle that is absolutely central to today's climate negotiations: common but differentiated responsibilities. You'll often see it shortened to CBDR. The logic is actually pretty straightforward. The responsibility is common because, hey, we all share one planet. But our specific jobs are differentiated because some countries, historically, played a much bigger role in causing the problem, and they also have a much greater capacity to fix it. This principle essentially says developed nations need to lead the way. So let's pull it all together now. Let's look at how this entire journey has continued moving forward into the 21st century. You can see this really clear, logical progression on the timeline. Stockholm lays the foundation, Rio builds the main framework with sustainable development, Johannesburg pushes everyone to actually implement the plans. And that leads directly to the Millennium Development Goals and then their successors, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And then, in 2022, 50 years after that first conference, the UN General Assembly takes this incredible step and recognizes a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a universal human right. And that brings us to our final, really critical question. The legal architecture is pretty much in place. The principles are well established. We even have a recognized human right now. So as we look to the future, maybe the biggest challenge isn't about creating new rules anymore, but about building the political will and the legal muscle to actually enforce the ones we already have.